Everyone says India needs America. But what if this time America needs India more? Let's say the quiet thing out loud. The world's power tables are shifting. The guest no one once noticed is now setting the menu. India didn't storm out of rooms. It simply stopped asking for permission to speak. And that, more than any treaty or trade deal, is how power truly changes hands. Her context, the background or imbalance. For decades, India was told its place. Be the democracy the West could quote in speeches. Be the market everyone could sell to. Be the partner that never asks for too much. Washington liked India as long as India listened. New Delhi was praised for reforms, scolded for restraint, and always reminded to stay aligned. It was a polite relationship, unequal but convenient. But here's the truth. Power partnerships built on approval are never real partnerships. They're performances. And for too long, India played the role others wrote for it. A shift. What changed? Then, quietly, something broke and something awoke. India began asking a different question. Why should power be borrowed when it can be built? The pandemic showed the fragility of Western supply chains. The Ukraine war showed the limits of moral lectures, and America's own contradictions between ideals and interests became too loud to ignore. When Washington said, "Choose sides," India replied, "We choose our interests." When the West fretted about oil from Russia, India bought it and made it work for its people. When the world argued over who should lead the global South, India simply hosted them and led. India stopped reacting. It started defining, and that changed everything. Because the moment you stop chasing validation, the world starts chasing you. Hey, impact. What it means. So yes, India is walking away, but not from America. It's walking away from dependence, from the old grammar of geopolitics. Today, the United States finds itself in a strange position, needing what India uniquely offers: a billion-person democracy that still believes in democracy, a counterweight to China without colonial baggage, a tech hub that speaks English and the language of ambition, a moral compass in a world adrift. In other words, India isn't America's project anymore. It's America's partner, and sometimes its mirror. Because here's the irony: the more India asserts its independence, the more valuable it becomes. And the more America lectures, the less it leads. Partnerships don't survive on sermons, they survive on respect. When India says strategic autonomy, it's not arrogance, it's experience. When America talks about shared values, India asks, shared for whom? Both democracies, both proud. But one learning humility, the other rediscovering dignity. Her resolution, the final thought: this isn't a breakup, it's a rebalancing. America once saw the world as a chessboard. India now plays a different game, one that rewards patience over power, listening over lecturing. India's rise isn't about replacing the West. It's about rewriting the West's assumptions. That leadership comes only from wealth. That influence is a privilege, not a purpose. That the global South should wait its turn. But here's the quiet revolution: India didn't wait. It worked, and work, not war, became its language of strength. So, is India walking away from America? Not exactly. It's walking toward itself. And that, perhaps, is what America fears most. Because once a nation learns to stand alone, it never kneels again. Final line, the thought that lingers: history isn't rewritten by those who shout the loudest, but by those who finally stop asking for permission to speak. For years, India lived under the shadow of expectation. It was expected to be the democracy that reassured the West, the market that fueled global ambition, and the moral voice that never raised its own too high. Every move, every policy, was measured not just in impact but in approval. What would Washington think? How would London react? The world had grown used to an India that listened more than it spoke, that explained itself before it acted, that waited for permission to rise. But quiet submission was never in India's nature. It was in its history to adapt, absorb, and then redefine. That redefinition began slowly, almost imperceptibly. A trade decision here, a diplomatic statement there, a refusal to bow to pressure over oil or alliances. These were not acts of rebellion, they were acts of recognition. Recognition that power borrowed is never real power. India began to understand that the applause of others could not be the measure of its success. True strength would come not from being seen as responsible by others, but by being answerable to its own people. The shift was intellectual before it was political. Indian diplomacy shed its anxiety about alignment. It replaced appeasement with assertion, sentiment with strategy. The vocabulary changed. Non-alignment gave way to strategic autonomy. No longer an excuse for indecision, it became a declaration of intent, the right to choose, to differ, to act according to national interest. When the world asked India to take sides, it replied with a new logic: India doesn't pick sides, it picks outcomes. This quiet confidence unsettled many. Analysts in Washington and Brussels mistook independence for distance. They asked why India wasn't condemning fast enough, why it wasn't aligning neatly, why it wouldn't just choose the right camp. But the old game of global politics was built on camps and blocks. The new one, the one India is writing, is built on connections, not commands. India's refusal to follow wasn't defiance, it was maturity. A recognition that partnerships must be equal, that cooperation cannot come at the cost of sovereignty. The world's crisis, from pandemics to wars, had shown that dependence on others could be dangerous, even for the powerful. And if the mighty could stumble, then surely the wise could stand alone. What emerged was a nation comfortable in its contradictions, a friend to the West, a partner to the East, a voice for the South. It no longer felt the need to justify that balance. India realized that power isn't in choosing sides, it's in being the side others wish to choose. The confidence that once came from Western validation now comes from domestic conviction. The knowledge that its policies, its economy, its diplomacy are all serving a larger purpose rooted at home. In the end, India stopped seeking validation not out of pride, but out of clarity. It understood that respect is never granted, it's recognized. And recognition only comes to those who no longer wait for it. America once stood as the axis of global partnership, the hub around which the world revolved. For decades, nations sought its approval as a badge of legitimacy. To be favored by Washington was to be seen, to be trusted, to be relevant. India, too, once leaned toward that orbit, hoping to be understood, hoping to be accepted. But the world has changed, and with it, the geometry of dependence. The truth now is simpler, sharper, and quietly revolutionary. America needs India's independence more than India needs America's approval. In a fractured world where trust is currency and alignment is fragile, India's greatest strength is its ability to stand alone. It does not need endorsement to act, nor validation to speak. It moves with a purpose rooted in self-interest, but expressed in shared responsibility. America, for all its might, finds itself in need of partners that can stand firm without needing to be held. And India, precisely because it refuses to be molded, has become indispensable. In technology, defense, climate, and geopolitics, America sees in India something rare: a democratic counterbalance to authoritarian power, a stabilizing force in an unstable region, and a nation capable of saying no without burning bridges. This independence gives India credibility. It allows it to mediate where others cannot, to engage with Russia and the West in the same breath, to host the global South while partnering with the G7. For Washington, this is not defiance, it's utility. India's freedom to differ is now America's advantage. America's problem is not that it lacks power, it's that its power often isolates. Its policies divide even when its ideals inspire. India's presence softens those edges. When India speaks, it carries the weight of representation, not just of its billion citizens, but of nations long unheard. It can say what America cannot, and be heard where America cannot go. Independence becomes influence, and that influence becomes leverage not just for India, but for every country that wishes to escape the old binaries of world politics. There's also a moral undercurrent to this shift. The West, for all its rhetoric of equality, often expected obedience in return for partnership. India's refusal to conform is not a rejection of cooperation, it is an insistence on dignity. It's a reminder that friendship cannot be one-sided, that mutual respect must replace moral posturing. In this redefinition of terms, India's independence becomes not an obstacle, but a necessity, a new model for how great powers must relate in a multipolar world. America, to its credit, is learning. It now approaches India not as a subordinate, but as an equal. Aware that persuasion works better than pressure, it recognizes that an independent India strengthens democracy far more effectively than a compliant one. In this balance of autonomy and alliance lies the future of global order, not built on dependence, but on the rare trust between two nations strong enough to stand alone, yet wise enough to walk together. Respect has become the rarest currency in global politics. For too long, alliances have been built on imbalance, one side giving direction, the other following it. The Cold War taught nations to choose masters, not partners. The post-Cold War world dressed hierarchy in the language of cooperation, and somewhere in between, the idea of genuine equality was lost. But today, as the old order frays and new centers of power emerge, one truth is becoming clear: partnerships built on respect, not hierarchy, will shape the new world order. India stands at the center of this quiet revolution. It is not asking for favor, nor demanding allegiance. It is asking for something more profound: recognition that it brings ideas, not just numbers, principles, not just potential. For decades, the world spoke to India as a pupil. Now, it speaks to India as a peer, and that shift is not symbolic, it is structural. It represents a new way of thinking about collaboration, one that replaces instruction with conversation. In this new grammar of power, respect means allowing space for difference. It means that a country like India can buy Russian oil without being seen as disloyal, can trade with China while strengthening defense ties with the United States, can criticize global hypocrisy while contributing to global solutions. It's not contradiction, it's coherence, the coherence of a nation that knows its interests and pursues them without apology. When partners accept that autonomy, trust deepens. When they demand conformity, resentment grows. The world has seen enough of the latter. The West, especially America, is learning this lesson the hard way. Influence no longer flows from dominance, it flows from credibility, and credibility cannot be forced. It must be earned through respect for sovereignty, culture, and choice. For the first time in modern history, the world's most powerful democracy, and its largest democracy are bound not by dependence, but by dignity. That balance is fragile but transformative. It redefines power not as control, but as cooperation. If respect also changes the language of diplomacy, it turns deals into dialogues, partnerships into platforms. When India engages with the United States or Europe today, it does so with confidence. The confidence that comes from being indispensable, but not indebted. It no longer accepts praise as charity, nor criticism as command, and that self-assurance is infectious. It is teaching other nations, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, that they too can negotiate without kneeling. This evolution isn't just political, it's psychological. For centuries, international relations were built on fear, the fear of exclusion, the fear of punishment. Respect dismantles that fear. It replaces obedience with ownership. When nations feel seen, they contribute. When they are coerced, they resist. The success of the 21st century world will depend on which model prevails. Whether countries continue to repeat the old hierarchies of the past or embrace a new system where power is shared, not imposed, where respect is not earned by strength, but by integrity, and where the measure of leadership is not dominance, but understanding. Revolutions don't always come with fire and flags. Some arrive quietly, in the rhythm of consistent work, in the slow rewriting of perception. India's rise has not been a headline event, it has been a quiet revolution. No invasions, no declarations, no empire restored, just a nation steadily turning patience, purpose, and pride into power. In an age obsessed with instant influence, India has chosen endurance over applause. It has refused to mistake visibility for victory. Patience became India's weapon when the world underestimated it. While others rushed to assert dominance, India chose to build credibility. It invested in its institutions, its infrastructure, its people, knowing that strength without stability is just spectacle. The world noticed slowly. When India spoke at global forums, it did so with the calm of a country that no longer needed to prove itself. When it disagreed with the West, it did so without hostility. It was not defiance, it was self-assurance. That quiet confidence has become the most radical act in global politics today. Purpose has guided India through every shift. It knows its geography, its history, its limits, and its leverage. Its diplomacy is not driven by ideology, but by intent. Whether it is energy deals with Moscow, trade agreements with the Gulf, or technology partnerships with America, every move is shaped by a single idea: independence that serves interdependence. India understands that being global does not mean being unguided. It means standing firm while staying connected. That balance, once seen as impossible, is now its signature. This purpose-driven patience has created a new kind of influence. Not loud, but lasting. When India speaks of the global South, it speaks with the moral legitimacy of experience, the lived reality of a nation that was once overlooked, now leading those who still are. It represents aspiration without arrogance, leadership without dominance. In a world that often equates strength with noise, India's silence has become persuasive. It listens before it leads, and that listening has earned it something power rarely achieves: trust. And at the heart of it all lies pride. Not the pride that blinds, but the pride that grounds. The pride of a civilization that has endured for millennia, that has absorbed conquerors and outlasted empires, that has made resilience its inheritance. India's pride is not built on the ruins of others, it's built on the rebuilding of itself. Every election, every startup, every satellite is a continuation of that story. the story of a nation that refuses to let destiny be dictated to it. Together, this patience, purpose, and pride form a quiet storm, a slow, steady assertion of sovereignty in a world accustomed to submission. India doesn't need to dominate headlines because it dominates the horizon. Its revolution is not about changing the map of the world, but the mindset of it, showing that true power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to be ignored. For generations, the global order was written by a few and read by the rest. The powerful spoke, and the world listened. The smaller nations echoed those voices, often mistaking imitation for influence. To speak through others was to survive, to stay relevant, to be heard indirectly in a chorus that was never their own. But that age is fading. The future belongs to nations that speak for themselves, not through others. It belongs to countries confident enough to craft their own narratives, to define their interests without apology, to refuse the comfort of conformity. India stands at the center of this transformation. It has learned that borrowed voices can never carry the weight of authenticity. For decades, others interpreted India, its democracy, its decisions, its destiny. Now India is its own interpreter. It no longer allows think tanks in Washington or editorials in London to frame its identity. It speaks with the vocabulary of its own experience, a vocabulary shaped by struggle, diversity, and resilience. In that act of self-definition lies real sovereignty. When India articulates its foreign policy, it does not mimic anyone's model. It recognizes complexity where others demand clarity. It speaks of multipolarity not as a slogan, but as a lived necessity. Its worldview is not Western or Eastern. It is distinctly Indian, rooted in civilizational wisdom, yet adaptive to modern realities. That voice, calm but firm, unsettles those used to speaking for the world. It reminds them that leadership today is not about volume but vision, not about dictating but demonstrating. Speaking for oneself also means thinking for oneself. India does not let global consensus substitute for national conscience. When it abstains in votes that others dramatize, it is not indecision, it is discernment. It sees nuance where others see narrative. This independent thinking makes it a model for many in the global south, nations tired of being told what side of history they must stand on. They see in India a reflection of their own struggle to be heard, their own desire to escape the noise of moral superiority disguised as diplomacy. The power to speak for oneself is also the power to listen differently. When a nation finds its voice, it begins to hear others more clearly. India's dialogues with Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia reflect that empathy. It speaks as one of them, not for them. It doesn't claim to represent, it collaborates. That authenticity gives its words a moral gravity that cannot be manufactured through alliances or aid. This shift from dependence to dialogue, from echo to expression, is more than diplomatic evolution. It's philosophical renewal. It redefines what it means to be powerful in a world crowded with noise. The nations that will matter are not the loudest, but the clearest. Not those who repeat the old chorus, but those who dare to write new verses. Nations that understand that sovereignty begins in speech, in the courage to say, without hesitation or hesitation's disguise, this is who we are, this is what we stand for, and this time we will speak for ourselves.